The next thing I did with a Bullitt was I swapped in some nice tinted taillights. Now these were not just tinted over with window tint, they weren't cheaply painted. These were actually some really nice high quality painted taillights. So I actually got these taillights from my other GT, and if you recall the story of the other GT, it's the one my sister drives now, and it was a red fire metallic 2003 Mustang GT that had belonged to my friend, and unfortunately it got totaled and I bought it back from him. And not only did this car have the 410 axle that I swapped over to my Bullitt from the 373 axle I had, but this car also had these really nice taillights in it. And those taillights were done in a booth at a paint shop by his brother who worked at a collision repair center, and he did clear coat on them, everything. They looked beautiful. And I really like how he left the reverse light non-tinted. That looked great. And so in a lot of these pictures you're going to see those taillights in the car. Now I did get pulled over and the police made me take them out and do a inspection and show them I had taken them out and swapped them back. It was actually a pretty stupid thing where I was driving down the boulevard and a police car started coming up behind me, and I know he wanted to get me for any reason he could, and he followed me, and he didn't like the taillights. And so he even followed me down another street, and I went through a light right as it was turning yellow, and he ran a red light to catch up to me and pull me over just because he didn't like the taillights. And my friend actually went to court over this with his blue Mach 1. He had tinted taillights in his, and he actually fought the suit because they do reflect the color red, and he showed them some 2013 Mustang GT taillights. And these were stock taillights. Ford made them this way, and so he showed how they look tinted, and they're just as good as his were. And he actually won in court, and they said, you know, you don't need to change those back. And so my friend had always told me, just keep the case number from my court session and just show that to the police if they ever pull you over for that, because he had the precedent for that case. But I didn't have that with me. I always thought, well, I'll just tell the police the story, and of course he didn't care at all. He was like, license and registration. And I was like, well, look, you know, and I tried to tell him, and he just stared at me and said, license and registration. So I did, and I said, look, I live 3 blocks that way. I'll go right now and take him out. He said, nope, you're getting the ticket. And you got to take him out, and you got to go get another officer to pass him off. So it was really kind of dumb, but that's why you'll see the car has the tinted taillights in it. I wanted them in there for the dyno. I thought it was kind of aggressive, but I did have to take those out. So you'll see pictures of the car with and without them, and where I've switched them back out and in and out. But I decided ultimately it wasn't worth the trouble, so I just left them out. So the car looked really good, and the next thing I wanted to do was switch the exhaust around a little bit. I had the Loudmouth 1 exhaust, and I also had the Loudmouth 2 exhaust. So those are the SLP resonators. They're like the mufflers, these parts. And if you look at one of them, the bottom one is actually the Loudmouth 2, and you can see it's kind of a fatter taper, and it's not as skinny as the one on the top, which is the Loudmouth 1 on the top. And so it's hard to see, but the Loudmouth 2 is a larger diameter and has more insulation on the inside than the other, even though they're straight through mufflers. And the thicker ones are quieter. Yeah, you wouldn't think they are, but they have baffles inside. And I wanted to try to quiet it down a little bit because it was really loud with the cams. But then ultimately I loved how loud it was, and I went back and switched it back to being really loud. And so I did that a lot, and my Mach 1 had a set and the Bullitt had a set, and I was keeping the Loudmouth 2s on the Bullitt initially, and then I would switch them over to the Mach 1 and then back. And in the end I actually found another set of Loudmouth 1 resonators to go in, so both cars now have the Loudmouth 1, which is the louder one. So I'm going to show you some exhaust clips here of how the Bullitt at idle with the cams sounded so good. And the first couple videos here are with the Loudmouth 2s. You'll see how quiet they are, but they have kind of a deep grunt rumble to them. And then when you switch over to the Loudmouth 1s, it's just really loud. And I love the really loud because it sounds so good with the cams. So this is a set of those videos. So now with the new setup all installed and ready to go, I was not going to make the same mistake twice and have the car email tuned. I was going to get a dyno tune this time. And so it was really nice of my brother to let me borrow his truck. And I even borrowed this trailer from a friend. And after I got the trailer, I noticed that a couple of the tires on the trailer were in terrible shape, and the cords were showing on the inside, and they were split real bad. And I was doing this ultimately because, if you remember from the other videos, U-Haul kept giving me trouble for towing the Mustang on a trailer with a quarter-ton Chevy truck, or Suburban or anything. They said it wasn't heavy enough to tow. They wanted the truck to weigh half of what the trailer and the Mustang combined weighed. So obviously, because of all those reasons, I found a different trailer to take the car to the dyno on, and I ended up buying new tires for the trailer, and it cost me more than it would have been just to rent the U-Haul, but they were just giving me so much trouble at the time. So anyway, I decided to get a trailer, and I wanted to tow the car down. I made a dyno appointment, and we got the car all strapped up. We got it down to Las Vegas to Dyno Jet, and the guy who tuned there was really good with Mustangs, and he seemed to do really well. So he strapped it down to the dyno, and it was nice to get the car in there. Of course, I was a little bit nervous because it's a brand new build, and you don't know if it's just going to blow up on the dyno. But it did a good job, but there was an issue. Here's the pull. So the graph shows that the car pulls nice all the way up, but towards the higher RPM, anything over about 4,700 RPM, the car just went crazy. The engine lost communication with the computer. Everything went squiggly. It was losing power. We couldn't figure out what the problem was. He did several pulls. We changed ignition coils. We looked at spark plugs. He called his engine builder, a friend, and the guy said, "Oh, that looks like valve float." And I got on the forums, and everybody on the forum said, "There's no valve float in these cars. The tolerances are so low. If you float a valve, you're going to smack a piston and have PTV, or piston to valve clearance issues." And so we looked the graph over, and I did a lot of research, and you could see it was doing like 252 to the wheels, so we knew something was wrong. And of course I had to take the car home. This was all over a couple of weeks of digging into the car and figuring out what was wrong with it. And my dad came over, and we got the bore scope, and we took off one of the valve covers and looked down at the timing set. And I had done some research and found out that there's a chance that the HDR wheel could be on backwards. The HDR wheel's the wheel that the crank position sensor reads, and it's on front of the lower timing set by the lower timing sprocket. This is what it looks like, and so this sits on the face of the engine, and the crank position sensor pokes in sideways and reads those teeth. And if you look at those teeth towards the top here, I'll show you a little bit as we zoom in, you can see those teeth are actually pointed towards the camera right now. They aren't symmetrical. They actually point one way. And so you can see it would be confusing if somebody put this on backwards. Those teeth would now be pointed towards the back of the engine. And if you look at this wheel, on this bottom other section, the word front is stamped into the sheet metal there. And that front means front of the engine, or pointing towards the timing cover. But the guy who had put this engine together thought that front meant towards the front of the engine, so he put it on backwards. And I actually called and talked to the guy who built the engine. If you recall, he's the one who had the Silver GT that I ended up buying and taking the engine out. This engine had like 300 miles on it. He had just put it together. This HDR wheel is actually from my '02 True Blue GT that I had taken the engine out. The other one was all brand new. Everything was good, but this is just an example of what the HDR wheel looks like. So anyway, my dad was like, "Oh, yep, there it is. Wheels on backwards, your crank position sensor is not reading that." So what was happening was it could read it at low RPM, but once that thing started spinning up at high RPM, it would lose communication with the computer, and that was causing the issues. So what that meant was I had to take everything out, take the face of the engine off. I was basically going to have to take off the timing cover, valve covers, and what it was turning into was basically doing the job as if you were putting cams in the car again. And speaking of that, I looked at the valve springs, and I noticed that they looked like they were stock springs. And I talked to the previous owner, and he said, Yeah, that engine had stock valve springs. He wasn't planning on doing much with it. And of course, I had checked all these valve springs out because I thought maybe one of them was broken and that's why we were having valve train issues on top end. But they were all fine. But I did decide that if I'm going to do this whole job, I might as well take out the cams and change the valve springs out and put the comp ones in that are recommended. So I bought new valve springs for the car, and I had a friend in Vegas I had talked about who had built his whole engine and done all this before. He'd done cams, and I asked him to come up and help me because I'd never done this before. And so he came up from Vegas, and I actually paid him with a set of Willwood 6-piston brakes that came on that silver GT. I traded him his time and asked him to come up here and help me do all this, take the cams out, and then I would put those wheelwoods on his GT, which we did. And I also like that because then I could put stock Bullitt wheels back on that silver GT because I really wanted to have it that way. It reminded me of a car that was in the neighborhood, and I really wanted my GT to look that way again. And so it worked out for both of us, and so he came up and we started taking the engine apart. Now the issue I ran into was that March Performance underdrive pulley I talked about in the other video. This thing would not come off. You see it has an ARP bolt, which was nice, that had ARP hardware on the cams and everything, but I could not get that balancer off. Those holes do not line up with a standard crank puller, and I did everything I could to get it off, and unfortunately it did start to mess up the threads on the inside of the crank. So I had to go buy a tap to retap those threads and get them right, and I was so nervous. I went very, very slow, and it caught on just fine, and it went right in, and so it didn't really do much damage, but I was very upset about that. I had to buy all sorts of different types of pullers, and I bent bolts and everything just trying to get that dumb balancer off. So as soon as I got it off, I was so excited. I took it and I threw it and rolled it out of the garage into the street, and I was like, I am done with you, and I put a stock balancer back on. So looking at this picture with the timing cover off, I'll show you right here where the arrow is pointing. That is where the HDR wheel goes. It slides on the front of the crank, and that's the location. So for those who don't know, that's where the HDR wheel goes. So my friend came up and he brought this really cool tool with him, and it bolts onto the journals when you take the cams out, and this is to compress the valve springs, and then you use compressed air to put in the spark plug hole to hold the valves from falling down when you take the keepers off the back and when you take the valve springs out. And so it was really interesting. I'd never done anything like this. It was nice to have him there to teach me. And in this picture you can even see behind the ratchet there's that black hose that goes over the tool, over the head, and into the spark plug hole. So that's what you use with an air compressor to keep pressure in the cylinder so the valves don't fall in. It's like blowing them up with pressure so that they don't fall. And I also rotated the engine so that each piston was towards the top, if I remember correctly. I had the other block, the short block, next to me, and I could rotate it and see where the piston would be, and I had the pistons up as I did that. If I remember, I think that's how I did it, and that made it so that if a valve did fall, it wouldn't go too far. So there's a picture of what it looks like with the cam out of the cylinder head and all the valve springs installed correctly. And this was something that I thought a lot about because those tiny little keepers that hold the back of the valve stem on, you realize they're like puzzle pieces, and at high RPM those have to stay in, and if you don't do this right you'll destroy the whole engine. So it was nerve-wracking, but it was also very satisfying when you're running high RPM in this car and you know that I put this all back together myself. So I got it all put back together, and even though I loved these aluminum BBK higher displacement, higher rise valve covers, I went ahead and cleaned up the Bullitt ones to put them back on just because I was having the issue with the oil filler cap. And these were so nice. They cleaned up well. You can still see it even had the green dot from the assembly line on it. And I cleaned those valve covers up, and I put all new gaskets on the back, and I resealed everything and got the car all back together and ready to go back down to the dyno. And while I was in there, I actually had to move the brake master cylinder out of the way to get those big valve covers off. So here's a picture of it. It was leaking. I bought a brand new one, so everything would be fine for the return at the dyno. And one thing I wanted to do real quick was, even though it had new ones, I put another set of brand new spark plugs in it so that everything was fine, had them gapped perfectly, and I was ready to go back. And so with all the issues with the trailer, I felt like I was okay to go ahead and drive the car to the dyno this time. It was tuned for bottom end, so I could drive it down there. We got it all strapped down to the dyno. Of course, it looked really good, and of course, I was nervous again, hopefully that everything went well. And so here was the dyno pull with the changes. 304? Man, that sounded good too. Nice. So the tuner got out and he said, "Wow, it's healthy now. Whatever you did, it fixed the problem." And I was so excited to hear that because you don't know, on the other poles, it didn't even seem like there was anything wrong. It was just losing power up top and it didn't like make clattering noises or have problems. But so when he got out of the car, he said it was great. And once I saw that number of 304 to the wheels, I was really excited because that's what a Mach 1 dyno's at, and the car was doing great, and it's low compression, it's built for boost, so everything went well. So you could see the curve looked great, top end was fixed. And so I was also very happy because earlier in the video I showed you it only made 252 to the wheels. I was hoping for 300, it made 304, and so everything was great with the car now. There was a little bit of an oil leak. You could see in the dyno video it was smoking a little bit, and that was just oil dripping onto the exhaust, and I'll get to that in a second. But the first thing we did is we took the car for a drive, and I went to the parking lot where I had to sleep in the car when it was broken. This is near the Speedway, a little gas station, and I wanted to take the car back there and have it running in perfect shape now because I was so worried in that exact parking spot, sleeping in the car when it was broken, and it was so terrible that I wanted to revisit that place only in a better situation now. And so in this short little video clip, you don't hear the car very well. It's not like it's super loud or anything, but what I like is just to stand there and look at the car running perfectly compared to how it was earlier when I was sitting in the car broken there. So here's that little video clip. So the Bullitt was dripping a little bit of oil. You would see it at idle, just drip, 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 and it was really annoying because I had a 2-hour drive and I was worried about losing oil. And we got onto the freeway and we got stuck in traffic. The whole freeway was shut down. Interstate 15, it was at a standstill, and it was like that for hours. And I said, I can't sit here and idle and just drip oil and let the car bleed to death. So we turned around at the next spot we could and we went back to Vegas, and we decided to go visit my grandma. But on the way we stopped at Voodoo Innovations and we saw Snow White. This Oxford White '03 Cobra was sitting outside and it was in terrible shape. I had no idea that a Terminator would ever get to this point. And I have a whole video about this car. Turns out it was a very, very awesome street credit, street racer car. And it's one of my favorite white Terminators out there now. And I have a whole story about that. I'll put the link in the description if you want to see the story about that car. But we stopped and we looked it over and we were looking at all the cars there. And the owner came out and he asked us what we were doing, and we showed him the Bullitt, said we're just Mustang enthusiasts and we're looking at this Cobra that's sitting here. And he was like, well, people come by here and sometimes they want to steal parts and stuff, so I'm sorry if I was a little rude, but you know, you got to realize you're out here looking at a car in the parking lot, and that I'm going to wonder. And so we started talking to him, and he had one of the fastest Terminators in the world at that time. And so we told him that we knew all about who he was and everything, and he lightened up a little bit. But that white Terminator was very interesting to see in that condition. And I actually know where the car is now, and my friend is actually working on it. Hopefully it gets back and running again. It was swapped to a turbo car and everything. But anyway, so it took all night to get home. By the time we went to my grandma's, watched a movie, we waited around, and then the freeway cleared up. And so we got the car back home, and then I started looking into that oil leak, and that'll be in the next video. So thanks for watching, and I'm really excited to share this. This is a huge project. There's so much more to come. This story is incredible. So I hope you enjoy this. Subscribe and stay tuned for more parts of this video.